In November of 1914, 3 men rode a mine cage 1,200 feet into a Colorado mountain and stepped into a room whose walls were covered in gold. The crystals were the size of thumbnails, glittering in the lamplight against dark rock, and the floor was carpeted in 2 feet of powdery ore that assayed at 800 ounces of gold per ton. The cave, a geological formation called a vug, measured 40 feet high, 20 feet long, and 15 feet wide, shaped roughly like a pear standing on its narrow end. A newspaper reporter would later write that the men had stepped into a wonderland of solid gold, that pure gold boulders littered the floor amid piles of white, quartz-like spun glass. Most of that glittering material was actually calaverite, a gold telluride mineral, but the distinction hardly mattered to the balance sheet. Within the first week, miners scraped gold flakes from the walls by hand and filled sacks worth $40,000. Within a month, they'd pulled 1,400 sacks out of the chamber, $1.2 million in gold at $20.67 per ounce. At today's prices, the contents of that single cave would be worth somewhere north of $150 million. The mine superintendent, a man named Dick Roloffs, had been so paranoid about the discovery that he'd installed heavy vault doors at the mine entrance and required every miner to change clothes between shifts to prevent anyone from smuggling ore in their pockets. He'd hired armed guards to watch the gold at every stage, underground, on the surface, in transport, and all the way to the mill. He'd even refused to tell his own bookkeeper, Hildreth Frost, what he'd found. Frost worked out of an office in Colorado Springs, 20 miles away. When Roloffs summoned him urgently to Cripple Creek, Frost dropped everything and made the trip. But even then, Roloffs wouldn't explain. He made the bookkeeper sleep on it, in a room at the Palace Block on 2nd Street and Bennett Avenue, because you couldn't trust the walls of a boomtown. Only the next morning did he lead Frost and a mining colleague named Ed de Lavergne, a name that will come back in this story, down into the mountain to see for themselves. That cave was in the Cresson mine, in a district called Cripple Creek. By 1914, the district had already produced more gold than the California and Alaska gold rushes combined. Over 500 mines had operated within a few square miles. 28 men had become millionaires. The gold had built Colorado Springs into a city, funded the Broadmoor Hotel, and filled the coffers of mining exchanges from Denver to London. But the Cresson Vug was a last spectacular gasp from a place that was already, quietly, beginning to empty. To understand how a cave full of gold could feel like an ending rather than a beginning, you have to go back to a different man, a different century, and a gulch with one of the more ironic names in American history. His name was Robert Miller Womack, Bob to everyone who knew him, and Crazy Bob to everyone else. He was a cowboy born in Kentucky in 1844, who'd come west with his family in the 1870s and settled on a ranch in the shadow of Pikes Peak. The ranch, called the Broken Box, sat in a wide, high valley at nearly 9,500 feet, a place where cattle grazed on thin mountain grass and the creeks ran cold enough to cripple an animal that stumbled into one, which is, depending on which story you believe, how the area got its name. Bob Womack had no formal education in geology, no money to speak of, and a well-documented fondness for whiskey. He was locally renowned for one particular trick, the ability to gallop past a bourbon bottle on horseback, lean down, and grab it with his teeth. What he also had was a conviction, held stubbornly for well over a decade, that there was gold in the volcanic rock around his ranch. Nobody believed him. The area had been surveyed before and dismissed. A geologist named H.T. Wood, working with the Hayden Survey, had passed through in 1873 and returned the following year with a hunch that the region was promising. But he and his team gave up looking. Worse, a fraudulent gold strike near Mount Pisgah a few years later, someone had salted the ground with planted gold, had drawn 3,000 prospectors to the area for nothing, and left the whole region west of Pikes Peak with a reputation as a fool's errand. When Womack showed up in Colorado Springs, saloons firing his pistol and hollering about gold, people chalked it up to liquor. He'd found small amounts of placer gold in the creeks as early as 1878, but nothing that would interest an investor. The locals had a phrase for his obsession: Crazy Bob's at it again. Then, in October of 1890, Womack dug a narrow shaft 30 feet into Tenderfoot Hill in a drainage called Poverty Gulch and struck a vein of gold ore. He staked his claim at the assay office in Colorado City and named it the El Paso Lode. The ore assayed at $250 a ton. For the first time, the numbers were serious. According to an account that later appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, he came whooping into Colorado Springs, firing his gun and crowing about his discovery in classic Crazy Bob fashion. He displayed gold samples in a Colorado Springs department store window, trying to attract investors, and this time a few people took notice, among them a geologist and mineral enthusiast named Ed de Lavergne. De Lavergne recognized the samples as gold telluride ore, a formation so rare in the American West that most prospectors wouldn't have known what they were looking at. This was the same Ed de Lavergne who, 24 years later, would descend into the Cresson mine to see the vug of gold crystals, the man who'd been there at the beginning and would be there for one of the last great moments. But in 1890, he was simply an investor with sharp eyes. He staked his own claim. News began to spread, and a rancher named Horace Bennett and his partner Julius Myers, who owned the Broken Box Ranch land where much of the gold lay, platted a town site. By late 1891, the $300 million cow pasture, as it would eventually be known, was crawling with prospectors. And Bob Womack, the man who had spent a decade proving the gold was there, sold his claim. The price, depending on which account you trust, was somewhere between $300 and $500. One version says it included a bottle of whiskey. Another says he lost it in a poker game. Another says he sold it to a dentist named John Grannis to pay a hospital bill. Local legend holds that around Christmas of 1893, flush with whatever he'd received, Womack stood on Bennett Avenue handing out dollar bills to children and got into a fist fight when grown men tried to join the line. The specifics don't matter as much as the outcome. Womack walked away from a mine, soon to be known as the Gold King, that would eventually produce $5 million in gold. He never struck it rich. He spent his remaining years doing odd jobs for his sister at her boarding house in Colorado Springs, partially paralyzed from a stroke he suffered in 1904. When he died in August of 1909, at 64, he was virtually broke. His grave is in Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs, about 20 miles from the ground that made 28 other men millionaires. The name of the gulch where he found the gold, Poverty Gulch, turned out to describe not the place, but the man. The man who became the first of those millionaires was, in almost every way, Womack's opposite. Winfield Scott Stratton was a carpenter from Indiana, methodical, moody, and largely friendless. He had arrived in Colorado Springs in 1872, built furniture and door frames during the winters, and spent his summers obsessively prospecting for gold. Unlike Womack, Stratton invested in education. He studied metallurgy at the Colorado School of Mines and mineralogy at Colorado College. He'd spent 17 years failing to find anything significant. By 1891, he was in his 40s, divorced, and nearly broke. On July 4th, 1891, Independence Day, Stratton staked 2 claims on the south slope of Battle Mountain, not far from Poverty Gulch. He named them the Independence and the Washington. Early assays from the Independence showed gold worth $380 per ton. One boulder pulled from the mine brought $60,000, which Stratton used to sink a deeper shaft and tap directly into a rich vein. By 1893, he hit a major lode, and by 1894, he was a millionaire, the Cripple Creek district's first. The Independence mine ultimately produced nearly $4 million in gold before Stratton sold it in 1899 to a group of London investors for $11 million. Stratton became something rare in the annals of Western wealth, a rich man who seemed genuinely troubled by his money. He built the Colorado Springs streetcar system, gave land for the city hall and the county courthouse, funded a professional baseball stadium, and, in an act of either generosity or guilt, wrote Bob Womack a check for $5,000. His largest bequest was the Myron Stratton Home, an institution for orphans and the elderly poor, named for his father. He died in 1902 at 54, and his estate was immediately dragged into 11 years of litigation by would-be heirs. The home survived. It's still operating today. But Stratton was only the beginning. Between 1891 and 1900, the district around Cripple Creek produced a staggering acceleration of wealth and population that is difficult to fully grasp. At the start of 1891, fewer than 500 people lived in the area. By 1893, there were 10,000, arriving at a rate of 500 a month. By 1900, the broader mining district held somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people. The exact figure depends on who was counting and what they counted, making Cripple Creek briefly the fourth largest city in Colorado. The production numbers were even more striking. By 1894, 150 mines were active, pulling nearly $3 million in gold per year. By 1900, annual production hit $18 million, roughly two-thirds of Colorado's entire gold output. The district was, by the late 1890s, the single richest gold field on Earth. All of this was happening at nearly 10,000 feet above sea level on the western flank of Pikes Peak, in a place that was snowbound for months every winter and had no navigable river, no natural harbor, and no easy road to anywhere. What it had was gold embedded in volcanic rock, the remnants of an ancient caldera, tens of millions of years old, whose lava extrusions had deposited veins of gold telluride ore in patterns that geologists would spend decades mapping. The gold wasn't in riverbeds or surface deposits the way it had been in California. It was underground, locked in hard rock, and extracting it required capital, machinery, and labor. This meant Cripple Creek was never really a prospector's camp in the romantic sense. It was, from almost the beginning, an industrial operation, and that shaped everything about the city that grew around it. By 1894, two railroads were racing to reach the district. The Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad, a narrow-gauge line, arrived first in July of that year, snaking up through Phantom Canyon from the Arkansas River Valley to cheering crowds. The Midland Terminal followed in December 1895, connecting Cripple Creek to Divide and from there to Colorado Springs. A third line, the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District Railway, would open by 1901. At their peak, these railroads ran as many as 10 trains a day, hauling ore downhill to mills in Florence and Colorado City, and bringing back lumber, dynamite, machinery, groceries, champagne, and people. The Midland Terminal Depot, built at the east end of Bennett Avenue in 1896, was a 3-story sandstone and brick building with separate men's and women's waiting rooms, indoor plumbing, electricity, and telephone service. The station master and his family lived on the top floor. Bennett Avenue was the spine of the city, the main commercial street running east to west, lined with the businesses that served a population spending gold dust money. By the mid-1890s, the district boasted 150 saloons, 49 grocery stores, 25 restaurants, 4 department stores, 72 lawyers, 90 doctors, and 15 newspapers. There were 34 churches, a business college, and a county school district with 19 schools and 118 teachers educating 4,000 students. The Cripple Creek Stock Exchange opened on January 21, 1896 on Bennett Avenue, giving the district its own trading floor for mining shares. And 1 block south of Bennett, running parallel, was Myers Avenue, the red light district, home to more than 300 prostitutes, dance halls, opium dens, and parlor houses that never closed. The city taxed the trade, $6 a month per prostitute, $16 per madam. Pearl DeVere, the most famous madam, ran the old Homestead Parlor House, where she reportedly charged clients up to $250 a night and furnished the place with electricity, a telephone, and hot running water. She died of a morphine overdose in 1897. The building still stands. February of 1896 brought the completion of the National Hotel, the largest and tallest structure in Cripple Creek. It had 150 rooms, 40 suites, Turkish baths, an elevator, and its own electric light plant. Contemporary accounts compared it to the finest hotels in Denver. It cost $150,000 to build. Serious money for a town that had existed for barely 5 years. Remember the National Hotel. It matters later. 2 months after the hotel opened its doors, Cripple Creek burned. April 25th, 1896, was a clear and bright day. The Cripple Creek Morning Times ran an interview with Mayor George Pierce on the front page, in which he boasted that the city's new waterworks system made it possible to control and extinguish the most serious conflagrations, and that citizens could henceforth be free of this terror. That evening, in a dance hall on Myers Avenue, a woman named Jenny LaRue got into a fight with her boyfriend, a bartender named Otto Floto, and in the struggle, an oil lamp was knocked over, setting fire to the curtains. The wooden buildings of the red light district went up like kindling. A 12-year-old girl named Mabel Barbie, whose father was a barely successful prospector, was raking up the backyard of their cottage when she heard a gunshot, then 5 more. The alarm. She watched as billows of heavy smoke streaked with thin purplish streamers rolled from the Tenderloin toward Bennett Avenue. The horse-drawn fire engine rushed to the scene, but the fire hose, she later wrote, had no more effect than a lawn sprinkler. The fire spread north, jumping from building to wooden building in the dry mountain air. Fire departments from Victor, Florence, Colorado Springs, and Denver raced to help. Buildings in the fire's path were dynamited in desperate attempts to create fire breaks. By morning, roughly a quarter of the city was gone, and 3,600 people were homeless. In one of the more darkly comic incidents, a man who belonged to an anti-Catholic society entered the Sisters of Mercy Hospital and attempted to destroy the building by stuffing dynamite into the kitchen stove chimney. The dynamite detonated prematurely, blowing off his leg while causing only minor damage to the hospital. The nuns treated his injuries with the same compassion they showed every other patient. They kept his shoe, which had landed in the tea kettle, as a memento. 4 days later, on April 29th, it happened again. A cook at the Portland Hotel spilled a kettle of grease on a hot stove. This second fire was worse. Mabel Barbie watched as a flash of crimson lit the sky above the Portland Hotel at the corner of 2nd and Myers, and all that had been left of Bennett Avenue became a spiraling mass of smoke and flames. The second fire consumed most of what the first had spared, burning from Myers to Bennett and taking out another third of the city. Between the two fires, 40 blocks of businesses were destroyed, more than 1,000 houses were leveled, and at least 6 people were killed. Probably more, since some bodies were believed to have been completely consumed in the blaze. The damage totaled roughly $3 million. 5,000 people were homeless. The city, a journalist wrote, had literally disappeared. That night, trains loaded with food, provisions, and building supplies arrived from Colorado Springs and Denver. Winfield Scott Stratton, the moody carpenter who'd become a millionaire, insisted that all emergency costs be charged to him. Jimmy Burns, the co-owner of the Portland mine, was on the telephone with the Colorado Springs mayor within hours, organizing relief. And then Cripple Creek did something that defined its character more than the gold ever had. It rebuilt, not in wood, but in brick. 6 local brickyards went into full production. Within months, Bennett Avenue was rising again, this time in red brick with sandstone trim, glazed storefronts, and decorative friezes. The facades were stamped with the year of construction. You can still walk down the street today and read 1896 and 1897 and 1899 carved into the lintels. The residents didn't see the fires as catastrophe. They saw them as liberation from the flimsy wooden camp they'd been living in. Some even called it a blessing in disguise, noting that the fires had destroyed many of the saloons and brothels that fostered crime. The brick city that rose from the ashes looked, for the first time, permanent. It looked like a place that intended to last. The years between 1896 and 1903 were Cripple Creek's zenith. The Portland mine alone employed over 700 miners and would ultimately produce $60 million across half a century of operation. Over 8,000 men worked underground in the district, earning $3 a day, decent wages for the era. Most miners supplemented their income by as much as a third through a practice called high grading, stealing high-grade ore. The gold telluride minerals in Cripple Creek were often visible to the naked eye, which made the temptation constant and the practice epidemic. Mine owners fought it with strip searches, locked changing rooms, and surveillance. But it never really stopped. The miners paid $1.75 a week for an unfurnished house, or $2.50 for a boarding house that included a room, bath, and meals. The city that served them was, for a few years, genuinely urban in a way that seems impossible at 9,500 feet. There were 2 opera houses and the Butte Theater, where touring companies performed for audiences whose money came from underground. There was an electric streetcar system, 2 separate lines, connecting the district's scattered settlements. There were baseball games and boxing matches. 40 stockbrokers tracked mining shares on the Cripple Creek Stock Exchange, opened in January 1896 on Bennett Avenue. 8 daily newspapers competed for readers. The district department store at 236 East Bennett carried goods that rivaled what you could find in Denver, and the whole improbable machine was fed by 3 railroads, hauling ore downhill to the mills and bringing civilization back up. The wealth this machine generated flowed mostly not to Denver, but to Colorado Springs, 20 miles to the east, where the mine owners lived and the population doubled between 1891 and 1901. This is one of Cripple Creek's central ironies. The gold came out of the mountain in Teller County, but the money landed in El Paso County. The miners who swung the picks lived in boarding houses at 9,500 feet. The men who owned the mines lived in mansions at 6,000 feet, in a city they'd furnished with the proceeds. At least 28 Colorado Springs residents became millionaires from Cripple Creek gold. Spencer Penrose, a Philadelphia blue blood who'd arrived in Colorado nearly penniless, made his first fortune through the COD mine in Cripple Creek and a gold processing mill he co-owned with his friend Charles Tutt. His friend had loaned him $500 to get started. Within a few years, they were processing ore at an industrial scale. The Cripple Creek profits led Penrose to back a young geologist named Dan Jackling in an experimental method for mining low-grade copper in Bingham Canyon, Utah, which made Penrose enormously wealthy. He used that fortune to build the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, which opened in June 1918, designed by Warren and Wetmore, the architects of Grand Central Terminal, and remains one of the most famous resort hotels in America. The Broadmoor was, in a very real sense, built with Cripple Creek gold. So were the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, the Pikes Peak Highway, and the Will Rogers Shrine of the Sun. Albert Carlton, who'd arrived in Colorado as a tuberculosis patient and started as a dry goods clerk before latching onto the 1891 boom with a freight hauling business he ran with his brother, eventually consolidated most of the district's mines under the Golden Cycle Mining and Reduction Company and earned the nickname King of Cripple Creek. The gold flowed out of the mountain and materialized as civic institutions, grand buildings, and dynastic fortunes, all of them miles away from the mines where men earned $3 a day. Up in the district, the men who actually swung the picks and drilled the shafts lived a different story. By the mid-1890s, miners in Cripple Creek had joined the Western Federation of Miners, one of the most powerful and militant labor unions in the American West. The first strike came in 1894, when mine owners tried to extend the workday from 8 hours to 10 without raising pay. The WFM organized a walkout. Mine owners hired strikebreakers and deputized private security forces. Armed conflict followed. Miners took near-autonomous control of parts of the district, and at one point the governor of Colorado called out the National Guard. One of the few times in American history a governor deployed troops to protect strikers from anti-union violence. The miners won that round. The 8-hour day held. 9 years later, in 1903, the truce collapsed. Mine owners cut wages and broke agreements, and the WFM called nearly 4,000 miners off the job. This time, the governor was James Peabody, who was far less sympathetic to labor. What followed was one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history, a 15-month war fought with dynamite, rifles, and deportation orders. Peabody declared martial law. The National Guard occupied the district. Habeas corpus was suspended. Citizens were ordered to surrender their firearms. Walking down the street in Cripple Creek without a stated destination was declared illegal. The staff of the Victor Daily Record was arrested after printing an editorial critical of the mine owners. In January 1904, 16 strikebreakers were killed when a mine elevator cable snapped. Sabotage was suspected but never proven. Then on June 6, 1904, at 2:15 in the morning, a bomb packed with between 150 and 200 pounds of dynamite detonated beneath the loading platform of the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad Depot at the small settlement of Independence near Battle Mountain. A shift of miners from the Findlay mine had been waiting for a train. 13 men were killed. 20 more were injured. The blast blew one miner 150 feet from the platform and broke windows in towns over a mile away. The perpetrators, later identified as Harry Orchard and Steve Adams, who had covered the soles of their shoes with kerosene to foil the bloodhounds, were connected to the WFM, though the full truth of who directed the bombing remains contested to this day. The depot explosion was the end of the union in Cripple Creek. Mine owners and their Citizens Alliance used it as justification for a final purge. A mob attacked the WFM Union Hall in Victor. You can still see the bullet holes in the building today. At least 230 miners who refused to renounce the Union were rounded up, loaded onto trains, and deported across the state line into Kansas, left on the prairie miles from any town. The mine owners set up what amounted to kangaroo courts to try remaining Union sympathizers. Landlords were pressured not to rent to anyone with Union ties. New employees were required to sign yellow dog contracts, pledging never to join a union. One historian later wrote that there was no episode in American labor history in which violence was as systematically used by employers as in the Colorado labor wars of 1903 and 1904. The mine owners had won. The Union was destroyed, and the funeral procession for the 13 dead miners moved slowly down Bennett Avenue, the same brick street where the stock exchange operated, where the National Hotel gleamed, where the storefronts displayed the best goods money could buy. The same street, built to last. Cripple Creek didn't collapse after the labor wars. The mines kept producing. Gold output in 1900 had been nearly 1 million ounces. It tapered slowly through the first decade of the new century, but remained significant. The Roosevelt Drainage Tunnel, begun in 1907 and completed a decade later, extended 5 miles into the mountain to drain water from the deeper shafts, allowing mining to continue at greater depths. The Cresson Vug discovery in 1914, that underground cave of gold crystals, generated international headlines and briefly revived optimism. But the trajectory was clear. By 1920, more than half the district's mines had closed. Only 40 operations were still running. The Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District Railroad stopped service that year, and with it went the easiest route to the outside world. Railroads were the lifeline of a town at 9,500 feet with no other industry, and when they stopped, people followed. Population drained steadily through the 1920s. During the 1930s and 1940s, hundreds of frame and brick homes in the residential districts were demolished, some for salvage, some simply abandoned and left to decay. The National Hotel, that $150,000 showpiece with its Turkish baths and elevator, completed just 2 months before the fires of 1896, was torn down during this period. Not by a wrecking ball, not by fire, not by any dramatic catastrophe. The town had simply died around it, and someone demolished it for its brick. A museum curator in Cripple Creek later put it plainly. The hotel was like the Broadmoor of its time, but the town died during the 1920s, so they tore the hotel down for brick. The building that had been the pride of Bennett Avenue, built to announce that Cripple Creek was a real city with real permanence, was worth more as raw material than as a standing structure. There was a brief revival in the mid-1930s when the Depression drove gold prices up and labor costs down. Production hit $3.5 million in 1935. But the federal government suspended all gold mining during World War II as a non-essential industry, and many Cripple Creek mines never reopened. After the war, houses were abandoned or converted to summer homes. The Midland Terminal Railroad, the line that had once run 10 trains a day, with parlor cars and champagne dinners for overnight excursions from Denver, made its last run in 1949. By 1950, the district's population had fallen below 2,000. By 1960, Cripple Creek itself held fewer than 1,000 people. Nearly all the small mining towns that had clustered around the district, Altman, which had once perched at 10,620 feet and held 2,000 residents, Anaconda, destroyed by fire in 1904, Independence, where the depot had been dynamited, were ghost towns. Only Cripple Creek, Victor, and a remnant of Goldfield hung on. Albert Carlton's Golden Cycle Corporation made one last grand attempt to keep the district alive. The Carlton Tunnel, a 6.5-mile bore financed at a cost of $2 million, was started in July 1939 and completed ahead of schedule in August 1941. It was 9 feet wide and 8 feet high, large enough to walk through, and it drained the flooded mines to a depth of 3,000 feet, deeper than the old Roosevelt Tunnel had managed. A superintendent named John Austin, a 6'8" giant of a man, drove his crews with bonus pay for fast work and shattered every tunneling record in the district's history. When the bore broke through, water roared from the tunnel mouth at nearly 10,000 gallons a minute. Mining men believed it would drain mines across a 30-square-mile radius and open new depths that had been sealed by groundwater for decades. The people of Cripple Creek believed another boom was coming. The newspapers ran the headline: the mines would be productive for another 20 years and add millions to the $450 million already taken from the district. A modern roasting cyanidation mill, the Carlton Mill, opened in 1951 and tested pioneering new gold recovery technology. But rising costs and a fixed gold price of $35 an ounce, unchanged since 1934, made the economics impossible. By 1945, there were only 20 mines still working. The mill and the last underground mines closed at the end of 1961. The district went dormant. The greatest gold camp on earth had produced over $500 million in ore, and it was done. By 1990, Cripple Creek's population had fallen to somewhere around 300 permanent residents within city limits, depending on who was counting. The town wasn't quite dead. A small tourist trade kept a few restaurants and bars open, and visitors could ride a narrow-gauge steam train on 4 miles of rebuilt track past mine dumps and head frames and the snow-capped Sangre de Cristo Range 60 miles to the southwest. But it was close. In the 1970s and 1980s, travelers who took the winding road from Colorado Springs could find themselves in an eerie, beautiful ruin. Empty storefronts with weathered signs lined Bennett Avenue. Victorian houses stood with lace curtains still hanging in broken windows. You could drive past block after block of emptiness and silence. The brick facades were intact, the carved dates still legible: 1896, 1897, 1899, but the buildings behind them were hollow. The old Midland Terminal Depot had been converted into a museum in 1953 by a Broadway producer named Blevins Davis, who'd decided to preserve some fragment of the history. The Imperial Hotel on 5th Street put on melodramas in its gold barroom theater. The old homestead, Pearl de Vere's parlor house on Myers Avenue, had been turned into one of the country's only brothel museums. It was picturesque. It was not a living city. And then came the casinos. In 1989, inspired by the example of Deadwood, South Dakota, where legalized gambling had generated revenue for historic preservation, civic leaders in Cripple Creek joined with Central City and Black Hawk to push for a state constitutional amendment allowing limited stakes gaming in 3 historic Colorado mining towns. The pitch was preservation, slot machines, and card tables in existing buildings, with a large share of revenue going to a state historical fund to protect historic places across Colorado. In November 1990, 57% of Colorado voters approved Amendment 4. The first casinos opened on October 1, 1991. The original idea was modest, existing businesses adding a few slot machines and a card table. What actually happened was a transformation. Casino companies bought up historic buildings on Bennett Avenue and renovated them, installing slot machines, poker tables, and blackjack in spaces that had once held grocery stores, saloons, assay offices, and law firms. The gaming revenue funded the restoration of brick facades, new sidewalks, improved streets, and lighting. The population climbed back toward 1,000. One of the largest casinos was named, with a showman's sense of irony, Womack's, after Crazy Bob, the man who found the gold and got nothing. The casinos undeniably saved the town from disappearing entirely. Buildings that would have crumbled were restored. Jobs returned. Tax revenue flowed to the state. 28% of gaming revenue went directly to the State Historical Fund, which has since distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to preservation projects across Colorado. The population climbed back toward 1,000, but what returned was not what had left. The 15 newspapers were gone. The 72 lawyers, the 90 doctors, the 34 churches, the 4,000 students, all gone. The Stock Exchange building on Bennett Avenue became an Elks Lodge. The site of the National Hotel, the one torn down for its brick, became a pizza restaurant called Ralph's Break Room. The red light district on Myers Avenue, once the liveliest street in the Old West, was mostly weedy vacant lots. The once solid row of storefronts along what had been Sin City, a street where businesses never closed, where 300 women worked, where the song "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight" was supposedly coined, had simply vanished. The casinos occupied the shell of the old city, preserved its brick exterior, and replaced its interior with something that has no particular relationship to Cripple Creek's actual history, except perhaps the gambling. There had always been gambling on Bennett Avenue. The stakes were just different. Meanwhile, and this is the part that might surprise, the gold never really stopped. In 1994, 3 years after the casinos opened, the Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mine began large-scale open-pit operations on the same ground where Stratton and Burns and Roloffs had drilled underground a century earlier. The mine uses modern heap-leaching technology to extract gold from ore so low-grade that the old-timers would have thrown it away. Rock with trace amounts of gold measured in fractions of a gram per ton, processed on one of the largest leach pads in the world. The operation produces hundreds of thousands of ounces per year, 322,000 ounces in 2019 alone, and employs over 500 people, making it one of the largest employers in Teller County. In the early 2000s, gold from this mine was used to re-gild the dome of the Colorado State Capitol in Denver. The mine has been expanded multiple times, sold from Anglo Gold Ashanti to Newmont to SSR Mining, and its proven reserves are measured in millions of ounces yet to be extracted. The volcano that formed the Cripple Creek caldera 30 million years ago deposited its gold with a generosity that is, even now, not fully exhausted. So here is where the story lands. The man who discovered the gold sold it for $300 and died in a boarding house. The carpenters and geologists who came next became millionaires and built Colorado Springs into a city. The miners who did the actual work earned $3 a day, went on strike, got dynamited and deported, and saw their union destroyed. The brick city that rose from the ashes of 1896 was torn down for salvage in the 1920s, and then, 70 years later, saved by slot machines. And the gold, the thing that started everything, the thing that built and burned and broke this place, is still coming out of the ground. Bennett Avenue still runs east to west through the center of Cripple Creek, still lined with the red brick facades that replaced the wooden buildings that burned in April of 1896. The carved dates are still there in the lintels. Inside, the slot machines chime. On the hill above town, the open pit of the Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mine cuts into the same volcanic rock that Bob Womack dug into with a pick and a shovel 135 years ago. The district has produced over 23 million ounces of gold across its lifetime, half of all the gold ever mined in Colorado. There's a bronze statue of Bob Womack in Cripple Creek City Park, near the corner of First Street and Bennett Avenue. It shows him as he might have looked in the early 1890s, lean, weathered, the man with the conviction and the bottle and the terrible timing. The statue faces the street he made possible, in the town his discovery built, in the district that produced more gold than anywhere else in the American West. He's a few inches of bronze in a city of brick. He never got to live in any of it. But the buildings he made possible, the ones that survived the fires and the decline and the decades of emptiness, those are still standing, still dated, still brick. They've outlasted the gold rush, the labor wars, the ghost town years, and the man who started it all. Whether that's a monument or an irony probably depends on how much you think a bottle of whiskey was worth in 1893.